Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So welcome. Everybody can take their seats. We'll get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeffrey Kahn. I'm the director of the Furman Institute of Bioethics. Not loud enough? It's a little far away for me to lean. Maybe we will do this. What's that?
Much better.
There we go. Okay, start again. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, Jeffrey Kahn. I'm the director of the Furman Institute of Bioethics here at Johns Hopkins, and it's my pleasure to offer some welcoming remarks for this 2025 Carlton Haywood Jr. Memorial Symposium. We're honored to co-sponsor this event this year with the Sickle Cell Center for Adults at Johns Hopkins. Thanks, Lydia, for that support wherever you are. The symposium represents an effort to honor and remember Carlton's legacy as a scholar and to remember him as a colleague, and for many here today and all of those he touched, to remember him as a friend. Carlton's work reminds us to listen to patients, to understand them as people and not merely as a diagnosis or an illness. He reminded us that patients are partners in their care and that trust in professionals is critical and requires understanding what it takes to build it and to maintain it. We remember him today on the occasion of this symposium named in his honor, and I ask that you keep his memory in your thoughts today, remembering his brilliance, his generosity, his kindness, his compassion, and his humility. Thank you all for being here and for participating in today's symposium. To say more about Carlton and his life and his impact, let me welcome my colleague, Mary Catherine Beach.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me with this mic? Yeah. Okay. Great. So, Carlton Haywood Jr. was a leader in sickle cell disease research and bioethics who died on December 31st, 2021 at the age of 46. In his short but impactful career, Dr. Haywood's distinguished scholarship and advocacy challenged the medical community to address significant injustices in the care of people with sickle cell disease. Carlton was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1976. He was a serious and ambitious student who earned an undergraduate degree at University of Virginia in religious studies and bioethics in 1999 and a master's at UVA in 2003 in bioethics. He then came to Johns Hopkins in 2008, graduated with a PhD in health policy and bioethics, and then joined our faculty in hematology and the Furman Institute. He was a unique and creative scholar who had both talent and the tenacity to lead impactful, internationally recognized research on the medical condition with which he lived. His scholarship highlighted issues of injustice and paved the way for improving the overall quality of care for those living with sickle cell disease. He worked generously as a mentor and in service to the sickle cell disease community, serving on numerous advisory committees throughout the country. He was a highly sought after speaker who often traveled in service of others despite the heavy toll it took on his physical health. Among the many awards and honors that he received, one of his favorite was recognition by the Ebony magazine's editorial team as one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the country. Carlton was a beloved son, brother, and friend. I believe his mother and his family and friends are online today, and so I wanted to recognize them. He loved them so much. He was also resilient, generous, patient, and kind. Under almost any circumstance, he had faith and saw the best in people. He was full of grace. Although his presence is missed, we hope to make his vision illuminate the path ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Matthews. I'm faculty in the Furman Institute of Bioethics in the Department of Genetic Medicine, and I chair the Haywood Symposium Committee. And I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker today. Dr. Keith Wailoo is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs. He's jointly appointed in the Department of History and in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's former Vice Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, former Chair of History, and former President of the American Association for the History of Medicine. His research straddles history and health policy, touching on drugs and drug policy, on the politics of race and health, on the interplay of identity, ethnicity, gender, and medicine, and on controversies in genetics and society. In 2021, he received the Dan David Prize for his, quote, influential body of historical scholarship focused on race, science, and health equity, and on the social implications of medical innovation, and on the politics of disease. And was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His writings have advanced historical and public understanding on a range of topics: racial disparities in healthcare, the cultural politics of pain and opioids, how pandemic changes society, and the FDA's decision to ban menthol cigarettes. His most recent book is Pushing Cool: Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette, which received the 2023 Hughes Prize from the British Society for the History of Science. I had the opportunity to work with him when he co-chaired with Keith Yamamoto, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee that produced the 2023 report Toward Equitable Innovation in Health and Medicine, a framework. The report represents a national governance framework to align emerging science, technology, and innovation with health and medicine with equity. Dr. Wailoo holds a PhD in the history of sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Yale University. In 2007, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine, and he is the recipient of many other academic honors, and I am honored to welcome here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Wailoo.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna, oh, I see, still trying to get my screen up on the screen. I will start by saying how pleased I am to be here to celebrate the life and work of Carlton Haywood. Fortunately, we tested this out earlier and it worked just fine. So what I would like to do is to speak to a historical theme that Professor Kahn just mentioned, which is the history of experience, the history of the patient's experience with sickle cell disease, based on the work that I've done, mostly with my second book, Dying in the City of the Blues, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health, but also referencing two other works, a book called The Troubled Dream of Genetic Medicine, and another recent book on the history and politics of pain. The other thing I'd like to do is to use the opportunity to reflect on the importance of this history for the way we think about genetic innovation today, and the promise of breakthroughs, whether those breakthroughs come in the form of bone marrow transplantation. What is that? I see. Okay, we want to plug in. Maybe. Should we try it that way?
Yeah. Let's go try that way.
Sorry. We just have to figure out what this plugs into. There's this one. This is going. No. Why is that? Anyway, well, I'm going to talk and I'll do a song and dance here. I'll try to act out all of my slides and maybe you can follow along. You can all gather around this laptop. So I came into the history of sickle cell disease through an interest in pain. One of the things that I learned in the course of doing that book is that, as we all know, sickle cell disease comes with a set of characteristic challenges, clinical challenges that include infection, early mortality, and recurring what are often called painful crises. So that's what we're gonna do. Okay, fine. What I also became aware of in doing this book is that sickle cell disease had traveled a fascinating and disturbing trajectory over the course of the 20th century, from a disease that was mostly invisible, lacking clinical and scientific and social visibility, to becoming scientifically and clinically important around mid-century, mid-20th century, and then acquiring a new set of social meanings in the 1960s and beyond. Characterized in the 1960s as a disease, as a new disease, although it was not new, characterized by pain and suffering among African Americans that had been too long ignored. You can see how the social visibility of the disease echoed the politics and the cultural changes at work in 1960s America, in which rising awareness of the disease resonated with the social and cultural currents of the era. But it was also in this era that, rooted in my study, which was focused on the Mid-South, Memphis, Tennessee, I also became aware of the fact that not only did sickle cell disease have a history of changing visibility, but it also, in some ways, there was a geography of sickle cell disease. One of the Memphis researchers that I focused on, Lemuel Diggs, who I'll talk about in a little bit, pointed out that, as sickle cell diseases prominence rose, the question of how to adequately treat people in sickle cell pain also became more widely debated. And he argued that people in Oakland and Chicago disagree with us here in Memphis. They feel that we undertreat people in sickle cell crisis, and we think that they overtreat people in sickle cell crisis. So disease not only has a history, it has a geography. And then I became aware of the fact that by the 1990s, the cultural context and the politics of disease had shifted. It's in this context that I encountered patients who confronted increasing skepticism, frustrations of nurses and ER workers about whether the person professing to be in sickle cell pain was not faking that pain or maybe catastrophizing that pain or exaggerating that pain in order to obtain drugs. Was this true pain or was this drug seeking? In fact, the cover of my book has an image that was, you'll see in close up later on, it's a 1990s book in which the caption underneath this image of a patient who is contorted with thorns sticking out of their body, the caption underneath said, "Before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real." So what I became aware of as I was bringing this book to fruition is that the task of finding pain relief had a history, it had a geography, and it had to contend in more recent times with the fact of skepticism and suspicion. This is one among many experiences for sickle cell disease patients who seek ethical and compassionate care. But it's a story that changes with the generations and across time. What I'd like to do today, really briefly, is to provide a history of how the story of pain is connected to other complexities in the history of progress and the perils associated with progress and the ethical controversies that emerge in the wake. Questions of recognition of disease and access to care, questions of stigma. And you see this play out in a number of different modalities, whether it's genetic testing and counseling, bone marrow transplantation, transfusion, pain care, as I just mentioned, the ethics of screening, and then ultimately gene editing and gene therapy. I want to suggest that there is a recognizable history of both progress and peril that has shadowed the history of people with sickle cell disease. That's the image that goes with that 1990s article. Before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real. And we'll encounter a lot of these images in subsequent slides. Now, sickle cell disease started in an interesting place, and it tells the story, you might say, of what doctors saw and what they did not see, and how sickle cell disease and people with the disease struggled for visibility, recognition, and clinical care from the very outset, and still today. The classic origin point of sickle cell disease in the North American context is the discovery. Of course, people had sickle cell disease before it was discovered by James Herrick in Chicago, who gave us the first clinical definition of the sickle-shaped red blood cells. For the purposes of my story, in Memphis, it started with this man, Lemuel Diggs, who got his MD here at Hopkins in 1925. And he'd like to tell an interesting story about how they trained medical students at Hopkins then. He said, one of his professors says, the way you will distinguish yourself is to find a rare disease and learn as much about it as possible. And sickle cell disease was his rare disease that he learned about based on Herrick's work and a few other studies and devoted himself to it. In some ways, he followed that disease where it took him and followed it as it became the disorder that we know today, from its rare origins to something that has a much wider profile. He began writing about sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia at the time, in 1920s, when it was regarded as rare. And when it was, he would describe the struggle for recognition in a number of different ways. He's the one who said people in the Oakland and Chicago think we undertreat, which is in the 1960s. But the struggle for recognition is a complicated one, and I think it's really important to begin by talking about that. The Mid-South, where he made his career, he's from Virginia originally, was defined by poverty, the prevalence of sharecropping, and extraordinarily limited access to healthcare. Memphis being one of the few places that had an array of small hospitals. It's a region of the world right there on the Mississippi that is characterized by high rates of malaria, high rates of tuberculosis, which was the leading cause of mortality in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and extraordinarily high infant mortality. The challenge of visibility and recognition was in some ways clinical and epidemiological, but it was also political and cultural. And in the early stages of the book, I learned, for instance, that in the 1934, the US Public Health Service issued a report having studied a number of different cities across the country and designating Memphis, Tennessee as one of the cities, the city with the leading infant mortality rate of cities its size in the country. If you want to understand how this was received and how it relates to the politics of disability, you could read it in the Memphis newspapers. For instance, the Memphis Commercial Appeal, which argued that this US PHS study should be read this way. Because Memphis has a large Negro population, and because it is a medical center for a large area in the tri-states, its infant mortality rate is necessarily higher. They're referring to its location just north of the border of Mississippi, just east of Arkansas. And they saw this as a problem of people outside the city from those cotton growing areas that came into the city and brought with them their health problems, their diseases. One Memphis obstetrician wrote, babies die, that should say, in Memphis who were not born here and whose parents do not live here. They were never in Memphis in many instances until they were brought here in a dying condition. This is a city that does not want to own this problem. The political response, physicians, scientists, and city health officials have tracked infant mortality deluxe in Memphis to its apparent retreat of safety, the 11th ward, where many foreign-born being from adjoining states, and Negroes keep the infant mortality rate up. So this gives you a sense of the challenge of visibility and the cultural politics of race and mortality in Memphis in the 1930s. The social and clinical visibility of disease is also shaped by, as I said, the politics of race in the Cotton South, in a city whose economic life is dominated by King Cotton. So you have a number of factors: the heavy toll of infectious disease, the lack of clinical knowledge. Lemuel Diggs is probably the only person, he's a pathologist by training, who knew about this thing called sickle cell disease. The desire of civic leaders to distance themselves from people they regarded as foreign, people who were seen as visiting blight on their city, not to mention the racism and segregation and racial exclusion of the time more generally. All of these factored in to the lack of visibility of sickle cell disease. But there's some epidemiological realities as well. The toll of malaria, which aggravated the problem of sickle cell disease recognition in a city in the heart of malaria country. The clinical recognition of sickle cell disease amidst malaria is a complicated one. It raises certain kinds of questions. Is the enlarged spleen of someone due to malaria or sickle cell disease? Is the recurring pain that's associated with disease due to a new disease that no one has ever heard of, or the familiar disease, the shakes and agues of malaria? You can see how, if you're inclined in public health to look for malaria, you will find malaria, and you will see these clinical manifestations as being caused by malaria. You'll also see pneumonia and infection in infants as pneumonia and infection in infants. You won't bother to think about any underlying reality because even in Lemuel Diggs's perspective, this is a rare disorder. In fact, Lemuel Diggs actually made this comment once where he said, the way you diagnose malaria is you use thick drop technique because you're looking for a microorganism. If you really want to see sickled cells, you would use a thin smear technique. So the diagnostic practices of the time were predisposed to looking for what was found, the politics of clinical invisibility. So when I say, what did doctors see? It is a complicated story. And what did patients experience? Well, that's a story that I discovered in this book is told not in the clinical record, but through other cultural means. Memphis being the birthplace of the blues in this time period, field hollers from the Cotton South in Mississippi and Arkansas, moving from the cotton fields through Mississippi, up through Beale Street, and giving rise to a particular kind of expression, a musical expression that's associated with stories of pain, suffering, loss, and death. And it's in this context that I stumbled across a song that seemed to capture, not because it's about sickle cell disease, but it's about what doctors see and what patients experience, that seemed to speak to me about the politics of experience from the standpoint of patients. It's a song called the Memphis Meningitis Blues, or Memphis Meningitis Blues by Memphis Minnie McCoy. And I'll read you some of its lyrics because you can see in its lyrics a metaphor about invisibility, about what patients experience and what doctors could not see. My head and neck was, I'd sing it if I could, but you should follow along. You should look it up online. My head and neck was paining me, feel like my back would break in two. My head and neck was paining me, feel like my back would break in two. Lord, I had such a mood that morning. I didn't know what else there was to do. My companion take me to the doctor. Doctor, please tell me my wife's complaint. And then he repeats. That doctor looked down, shook his head, said, I wouldn't mind telling you, son, but I can't. So here's a song that really explains like the limits of medicine's ability to see and understand the nature of African-American pain as sung, not in the clinical record, but through the motifs of the blues. Now, by mid-century, something dramatic happens to enhance the scientific and cultural, scientific, clinical, and then subsequently cultural visibility of sickle cell disease. And some of these developments are innovations, but they exist and they are developed outside of sickle cell expertise, and they come to have a bearing on sickle cell. One, for instance, is the development of both sulfa drugs, but then penicillin, and its wide utility during World War II. The dramatic impact of antibacterials is to treat the infections that are associated with a wide range of diseases, pneumonia, et cetera. And then, of course, to put it really bluntly, the kids who don't get better, you start to see an underlying reality. And so it's in this context that sickle cell disease, in the wake of more robust antibacterial medicine, becomes characterized, as does cystic fibrosis actually, as the great masquerader. A disease, it's like AIDS, right? You have AIDS, but you acquire other infectious diseases that then become the source of your mortality, of your death. So the same is true for sickle cell disease. And in this context also, Linus Pauling, biologist, discovers a missubstituted amino acid on the complex hemoglobin molecule that caused the sickling, the telltale sickling of the red blood cell. And it's in this context that, sorry, I have to close something here. It's in this context that sickle cell disease becomes, its visibility becomes enhanced clinically and also scientifically. In fact, so much so that in the wake of Linus Pauling's work, it becomes known as the first molecular disease at a time when molecular biology is coming into its own as a field, and claiming and pointing to this disease by saying, see, molecular changes in an amino acid in a hemoglobin molecule can produce a clinical disease. All diseases might look this way, shaped by these kinds of molecular processes. Another phenomenon of the World War period is the discovery of blood plasma transfusion. Once again, these are developments that exist external to sickle cell disease, but suddenly are applied to and can transform the way clinicians and scientists understand the disease. Blood plasma transfusion, another innovation of World War II, right? Being able to transfuse blood plasma, which can be preserved and transported and shipped at long distances, right? Suddenly can change the clinical possibilities of care. Now, this is also a place in which we come to understand that innovation, like blood plasma transfusion, brings both progress, but also peril and racialized controversy. Because at the time in 1940s, blood carries all kinds of racial meanings in the same way that we talk about genetics and genes carrying racial meanings. And so, not surprisingly, in a segregated society that is only just beginning to think about integration of things like the military or the involvement of Blacks in the military while maintaining segregation, blood transfusion meets a segregated US military, as the Army takes up the question of whether blood plasma should be racially segregated. And here is how that story is told in the pages in a cartoon in the New York Amsterdam News as an American tragedy. White soldier is bleeding and walks to the Red Cross van. And the driver says, "You might as well wait here, bud. We ain't got nothing but Negro blood left." The scientist is puzzling. Why? Because the labels have fallen off the two bottles. And he says, "What a dilemma. The labels have come off. Now, how can we tell the white from the Negro plasma?" The soldier in back says, "Hey, doc, so what? I ain't ranking." The next caption shows the implications. The white soldiers say, "Geez, looks like the colored lads is the only ones that's got round trip tickets to the hospital today. Guess they only got Negro blood. We gotta wait if we can last." And then the last caption really tells the story of like heroism and devotion and seeing beyond race. "Listen, doc," says the black GI, "if I need a transfusion, give me anybody's blood, so long as I get back to the front." This is the kind of politics of transfusions, things that we don't think of as having a racialized politics, that innovation carries with it these kinds of implications. By the 1950s, there's a new set of transfusion narratives, and you can find this now in the US News, in Time magazine, highlighting the rising visibility of sickle cell disease, the ability of patients to maybe weather the storms of infection, live a bit longer, to the point where they might be able to aspire, as Markland Walker does, to a college education. This is one patient's experience, is captured in the Time magazine. Caption underneath said, "Living on borrowed blood." It's a young woman with sickle cell disease aspiring to a college education, assisted by frequent blood transfusions. It's also a statement about the disease's rising visibility and the growth, the expansion of the expectancy of longevity. It's also an image of upward mobility that's characteristic of 1950s, conveying how medical therapy and sickle cell disease could be part of a story of integration and Black aspirations in that era in American history. A very different meaning of transfusion in the 50s than in the 1940s. Now, with progress, molecular biology, transfusion, there's always the shadow of danger and peril. Molecular biology, for instance, fed the search for molecular solutions, quick molecular solutions. And Linus Pauling himself generated a fair bit of biomedical and racial controversy in the wake. In the 50s, for instance, the search for de-sickling agents, after all, if a disease is caused by a missubstitution of an amino acid, surely, said one chemist, medicine may be able to devise a small innocuous molecule which might lock on to the defective hemoglobin and prevent the abnormal molecule from misbehaving. That promise went nowhere. In fact, it only produced problems. New developments like the use of an agent called urea, which promised to be the de-sickling agent that physicians and scientists were looking for, really only produced no clinical benefits and toxic side effects. There have been successes like hydroxyurea, which works by a different mechanism. It has nothing to do with stimulating or engaging in a kind of molecular fix so much as stimulating the production of fetal hemoglobin, which is correlated with a reduction, if not an outright cessation of painful crises, but it's not a cure. Through the 1960s and 70s, however, what medical science was leaning into is an understanding of the mechanisms of inheritance, leading to innovations and also deep controversies. Discovering that Tay-Sachs disease and sickle cell disease and CF share a common hereditary mechanism of inheritance. Autosomal recessive diseases, which bring each or transmitted from one generation to the other by a similar mechanism. Carrier parents, people with sickle cell trait, who have children together, same with Tay-Sachs, same with CF, each child has a 25% chance of having the disease, a 50% chance of being like their parents, people with the carriers, people with the trait. It's in this context that Linus Pauling, long associated with sickle cell disease because of his work, wrote this in the UCLA Law Review. I have suggested that there should be tattooed on the forehead of every young person a symbol showing possession of the sickle cell gene or whatever other similar gene that he has been found to possess in a single dose. If this were done, two people carrying the same serious defective gene in single dose would recognize the situation at first sight and would refrain from falling in love with one another. We could pause over this quote for quite a while. At the very least, it is deeply offensive, but it's also profoundly naive about what happens when you stigmatize people in the same way and publicly so. Not to mention using language like defective gene. You can see how this lays the groundwork for not only what was feared to be coercive genetic counseling, but also feeding concerns about whether these genetic counseling and screening programs did not carry an underlying agenda. It should be pointed out that federal sickle cell clinics, and I'll get to this in a second, pointed out that the avoidance of the birth of children with severe disabling diseases is not genocide, said those who argued for them. But the argument was really kind of laid out there by people like Linus Pauling, who were making this kind of public argument in the UCLA Law Review. Sickle cell disease, for many of us in the world of bioethics, is a kind of a case study in the ethics of disease prevention that runs astray because of these kinds of almost like eugenic ideals that underpin genetic counseling and how those programs created stigma in the effort to prevent disease. By the 1960s, sickle cell disease became, therefore, a fraught, more well-known, but a fraught symbol of the Black experience, of pain overcome, of pain too long ignored, but also of new pains being created out of that enhanced visibility. You could tell the story by looking at the star pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates, Doc Ellis, who had sickle cell trait. And there was an active debate about whether having trait was akin to having a mild form of the disease, or under what circumstances somebody with trait might develop symptoms of the disease. Was this a pathology, or was this just a kind of a normal state of being? You can also look at the following year, in which Richard Nixon, then launching the war on cancer, but enfolding the war on cancer into an argument that sickle cell disease also deserved its time in the sun and its funding. He said in his national address, a second targeted disease for concentrated research should be sickle cell anemia. It is a sad and shameful fact that the causes of this disease have been largely neglected throughout our history. We cannot rewrite the history of neglect, but we certainly can reverse it. And so it's also the time period that gives rise to popular activism, Black athletes like Muhammad Ali and Willie Stargell, leading campaigns to raise awareness and funds, and also films like the film with Sidney Poitier called A Warm December, which starts off as a kind of a intrigue and turns into a sickle cell disease awareness film. Worth watching. It's also, not to bring up a really raw and current subject, but it also highlights the role of presidents in the politics of NIH funding. So Nixon made this commitment, but as many people pointed out, he did not ask for any funding for sickle cell disease. And so NIH had to come up with where the funding would come from. And so they pulled money from cardiovascular disease to fund the sickle cell programs. As somebody at the time noticed, this was an example of robbing Peter to pay Paul for Dick's benefit. It highlights that, also the deep irony of cardiovascular disease being as significant, even not more significant a problem in the Black community and the population at large. But this is the politics of, disease and the NIH. By the 70s and 80s, sickle cell trait is also tied up in debates over employment discrimination and the ethics of employment discrimination. The US Air Force, for instance, starting in 1973, banned applicants who had sickle cell trait from serving as flight attendants, or I'm sorry, serving as pilots and others. And that was also followed by the airline industry. It would not be until 1981 that the US Air Force would rescind its ban. So you have 8 years of people with sickle cell trait not being able to serve in the Air Force. United Airlines is one of the first companies in 1973, shortly after announcing a ban, to lift its restrictions against people with sickle cell trait serving as flight attendants, becoming the first airline to cease employment discrimination. And so these are policies that were grounded in what you might call flawed beneficence, the idea that, well, we're doing this for your own good, that the likelihood or the possibility or even the slimmest of possibility that high altitudes might trigger a response in your body that could be life-threatening is enough to restrict an entire class of people from serving in these jobs, right? And so this is the way in which, as I said, innovation and progress laid the groundwork for stigma and discrimination. So if the 1960s and 70s were a time of recognition and compassion and care, albeit fraught and tense, depending on where you lived in the country, as well as discrimination and stigma and controversy, the 1980s and 1990s, at least as I saw it in this book, captured by this image, is an increasingly conservative era and a new politics of Black pain read through the lens increasingly of addiction politics. Thus, before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real because of increasing shifts in urban anxieties in ER workers about drug seeking. So patients in ER sittings increasingly confronted in the micropolitics of pain of, not truly being in pain. Is the pain real? If so, how aggressively should we treat it? With what mix of narcotics? Amidst the broader, formidable macropolitics of pain, which is asking other questions about whose pain matters in society and public policy, putting physicians increasingly in the position of not just gatekeepers, but suspicious gatekeepers, voicing suspicion, raising questions about cost, the financial costs of this kind of care for an expensive chronic illness, amidst fears of addiction and dependence. And so it's in this context that you begin to see studies like this by scholars, Knox Todd being one in Los Angeles and Atlanta, about racial and ethnic disparities in emergency department analgesic prescription. These are the kinds of anxieties and concerns that shadow the care of people. So, just very quickly, a history of breakthroughs as well as ethical controversies as sort of a thread that's woven through the history of sickle cell disease, through genetic testing, transfusions, pain care, access, screening, etc. And I should point out that, yes, the US Air Force rescinded its ban in 1981, but up until the early 2000s, the NCAA was debating mandatory screening of sickle cell trait, and as late as 2010, they approved it, and it was criticized by hematologists as discriminatory, and now the NCAA simply recommends testing. So an ongoing line of debate about to what extent this kind of beneficence is helpful or harmful. It is, however, an era that's defined by therapeutic progress, despite the ongoing controversy, rising life expectancy, because of what I might call quiet innovations with wide utility across medicine, antibiotics, transfusion, pain care, advancing the well-being of people with sickle cell disease, hydroxyurea. A few years ago, I gave a talk and I titled it The Ethical Predicament of Genetic Innovation. Because to me, the promise of gene editing and gene therapy, like the promise I'll speak about momentarily of bone marrow transplantation, are much more the kind of flashy breakthroughs, which can be technically effective, but fail to translate into across-the-board patient well-being, while raising profound new ethical and social challenges, sometimes enhancing stigma. A case in point is bone marrow transplantation. Bone marrow transplantation is a development that emerges, first case in 1991 about, which promises the possibility of, stem cell bone marrow cures for sickle cell disease. However, it comes with a cruel trade-off. Possibility of cure, a possibility of death from the procedure, and also the possibility of what's called graft versus host disease. Ernst Beutler, who had received the Nobel Prize for his work on bone marrow transplantation, said this about sickle cell disease and bone marrow transplantation: little would be gained by sickle cell disease patients if they merely traded the mortality associated with the primary disorder for a new set of disabling symptoms resulting from their treatment. But the ethics of that trade-off continue to be debated. The ethics of innovation and the breakthrough. And it's really with that in mind that when gene editing and gene therapy first emerged on the scene for sickle cell disease, I, as a historian, I can't help it. I'm trained as a historian. I read these developments through the long lens of history. I read it through the lens of, hydroxyurea, which makes a difference, and the difference between making a difference versus breakthrough. Quoting one hematologist who wrote, "I don't like the word breakthrough when asked about hydroxyurea because we can now show that this drug therapy can make a difference." It's a scaling back of the high-blown, overheated hype of breakthrough to think about what difference it makes to patients in their experience in the aggregate. And so this is the context in which people like Ernst Beutler, who did amazing work in bone marrow transplantation, had a kind of measured response. At the same time, I found myself puzzled as I was finishing my book that you had ethicists at UChicago who decided that the concern about bone marrow transplantation was itself overblown. And so what they did is published a piece where they did a survey of parents about how they felt about taking this risk. And stunningly to me, they argued that some parents were willing to take the risk. And they did a study that said there are certain kinds of parents who are willing to take a risk. Black parents who are of a higher socioeconomic level and who have girls. And they never saw this as problematic. They just thought as, let's ask patients what they want, and if they're willing to take the risk, let's let them take the risk. To me, this was some of the most fraught kind of, ethical studies that I've seen in this realm. Meanwhile, as bone marrow transplantation emerges and other hyped solutions, old controversies continue. I've mentioned the question of when and under what circumstances to test carriers. And then alongside of this, we have developments like this. This is from 2021 in the New York Times. The title, how a genetic trait in Black people can give the police cover. And this is a study of how sickle cell disease, how sickle cell trait is easily politicized and used to explain away police custody deaths in police custody. Sickle cell disease has been cited in dozens of police custody deaths, ruled accidental or natural, even though the condition is benign on its own. It cites a number of cases in which the police, faced with a death in custody, say, well, the patient had sickle cell trait, and therefore their death must be explained this way. Of course, the most infamous example of this was in the murder of George Floyd, in which Derek Chauvin, the police officer who was convicted, his lawyers tried to make this argument, and it failed. So to me, this is just like a part of the ongoing shadow of the racial controversies that shape the experience of sickle cell disease, the experience for patients and parents and carriers and many others. And it's into this fraught history of progress and peril that gene therapy for sickle cell disease emerged. And I was asked to write a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is where the title for my talk today comes from, Sickle Cell Disease, a History of Progress and Peril. And I take people through much of the history that I just provided here, but in a far foreshortened way. And I say, even the best therapy is a double-edged sword, presenting new conundrums. While bone marrow transplantation offers a possible cure, it brings the risk of graft versus host disease. The peril of gene therapy includes, for example, insertional oncogenesis, curing one disease, but producing another. And it's these kinds of anticipated, one is tempted to say unanticipated, but based on the history, you could say these are anticipated and predictable features. So gene therapy is a therapeutic breakthrough without question, but it's one that is expensive, well beyond the reach of most people with sickle cell disease. I would say, the vast, vast majority, within reach for only a few. It has an outsized role in the biomedical sciences, but it has a trivial role in the history of sickle cell experience. The problem of pain remains unresolved. Before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real. So to me, one of the problems or the challenges of genetic innovation and breakthroughs is the question of the experience of patients. Does this make a difference? And so articles like this, to me, speak more forcefully to what we should expect of biomedical innovation in sickle cell disease, but also across the board. Every time it's a battle, says this woman with sickle cell disease, in excruciating pain, sickle cell patients are shunted aside. And I would like ultimately to remind us of the fact that in the eyes of patients and the experience of patients, there are good and bad actors in their eyes. When my book came out, I got an email from a hematologist who I won't name, who wanted me to come and talk to the fellows and said, I read your book and I'm not sure whether I'm one of the good guys or the bad guys in your book. And I said, well, good, because that has surfaced the question that probably wasn't evident to you before, which is you have to assess your perspective on pain or transfusion or genetic innovations with an eye towards the good or the bad, the beneficial or the detrimental, and you take a long view perspective. I also got an email from the brother of an ER patient, and to me, this reminded me of or sort of alerted me to the fact of just attentiveness to unethical practice. He said, I now understand why we have such a difficult time getting treated. Shortly after the book came out, the National Sickle Cell Disease Association had a meeting in Memphis. And they asked me to come and give a keynote. And at first I was like, well, no, I don't really want to go back to Memphis. I've had my time, I've done. And they said, well, we titled the conference Thriving in the City of the Blues. And so I thought, okay, I'll come. right? Because they said, well, your history has something to teach all of us. And what I found fascinating is I went there, and to me, the highlight wasn't me. It was actually, speaking of experience, in concert with folks at St. Jude, music producers, here we are back to like the center of Beale Street and music production, had worked with young men with sickle cell disease to do a video that really spoke about their experience. And the video was called I Was Born With It. And there was a particular line in it that I thought was just so important. I was born with it, some of us die with it. Look in my eyes and you can see that I'm tired of it. And I just heard that and I thought, these are people talking about bloodshot eyes and another level of question I had not really fully grappled with, which is, are bloodshot eyes evidence of drug use? Or are they in some ways, evidence of like just tiredness? Or whether they are kind of clinical manifestations of sickle cell disease, but whatever, it's like they're calling attention to their eyes and saying, I'm tired of this. And they're working with St. Jude's to kind of increase awareness about the patient's experience at a level that I was not previously aware of. So I'll stop there by saying, I think it's really important as we do the history of disease, if you do the history of sickle cell disease, to move beyond just thinking about Herrick and Lemuel Diggs and Linus Pauling, right? And the cast of characters, but to try to insert like patient's experience and make it into the center of our disease, of our way of thinking about what the challenge is now and going forward. And if I had to say one thing about the limitations of the biomedical sciences innovation, is the fact that much of it has been pursued without proper attention to the question of experience, the question of what it means to live, or what it means to suffer, what it means to have pain, or what it means to die with sickle cell disease or other kinds of pain. So I'll stop there, and I've probably taken up too much time, but really appreciate the chance to chat.
Thank you so very much, and apologies about the technical difficulties. If you want to pick a seat there, I'll just, I should have given a little bit of a roadmap when I first introduced Dr. Wailoo. We're going to have a panel discussion. We have 2 of our 3 panelists are able to be with us today. Unfortunately, Tiona Wolford woke up ill and is unable to join us. But we have with us today Dr. Lydia Pecker. Dr. Pecker is a pediatric hematologist and the founding director of the Young Adult Clinic at the Sickle Cell Center for Adults at Johns Hopkins. She received her undergraduate degree in Africana Studies from Brown University and earned her MD at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. She completed residency training at Children's Hospital at Montefiore and completed a fellowship at the Children's National Medical Center and NIH's National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And Dr. Pecker's research focuses on reproductive health in girls and women with sickle cell disease. Dr. Pecker. Our second panelist is Dr. Yoram Unguru, a colleague of ours here at Hopkins and at Sinai. Dr. Unguru is a pediatric hematologist oncologist with joint faculty appointments at the Herman and Walter Samuelson Children's Hospital at Sinai and the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, where he's a core faculty member. He's also an associate professor in the School of Medicine here at Johns Hopkins. His research interests include clinical and research ethics. His scholarship and publications have focused on the role of children and providers in facilitating shared decision-making, end-of-life decision-making, allocation of scarce life-saving medications, and ethics education. Dr. Unguru also leads a multidisciplinary transnational working group examining the ethical and policy implications of chemotherapy shortages in childhood cancer. So we have asked Drs. Pecker and Unguru to do two things in brief remarks. First, to highlight something from Dr. Wailoo's talk that really resonated with them in their own work. And then because both of our panelists knew Carlton Haywood personally, we've also asked them to reflect on the relevance of this talk to Carlton's life and work. So I'll start here. I'll ask Lydia to speak first, Dr. Pecker to speak first, and then Dr. Unguru. And then we'll do some moderated Q&A, and then we will open questions to the audience. Dr. Pecker.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I wanted to say hi to Dr. Haywood's family and tell you that everyone at the Sickle Cell Center loves you and thinks of Carlton on a regular basis. Just wanted to start there by holding Carlton and his family. And so many people in our community who loved Dr. Haywood, learned from him in their care for him, learned by being students of his, and learned from reading his important body of scholarship that if you haven't had a chance to peruse, I couldn't recommend it higher. Dr. Wailoo, I wanted to tell you what a treat it is to be on this panel. I remember reading Dr. Haywood's papers at about the same time that I read Dying in the City of the Blues, which was when I was a resident at Montefiore and was called to work in sickle cell disease. And I was remembering as we were sitting there that Arlo Guthrie once said that songwriting is a little like fishing, and Bob Dylan got upstream of the rest of us. And I was feeling grateful for you for doing all that upstream work for those of us who were downstream in the waters. So thanks. I wanted to share with you a little bit about how your work has influenced my own work in reproductive health and sickle cell disease, in particular your essays in The Troubled Dream of Genetic Medicine, which if you haven't read it is a really a lovely book. Because so much of my work has centered on assisted reproductive technologies and sickle cell disease, but also the prevention of sickle cell disease for families who don't want to have a child with sickle cell disease. And I've been very interested in the pieces of the history in your book and that are drawn from the primary sources where people are really talking about what is the language of bringing these technologies, right? This is another place, just like gene therapy, just like bone marrow transplant, where we see a significant genetic advance, a significant scientific advance, and yet the social conditions and political conditions for offering that scientific advancement to this particular community are fraught by legacies of racism and also sexism and misogyny, and deeply tied to debates from the 1970s about how we talk about sickle trait, how we talk about inheritance, even the word prevention. You know, I always have to talk to my students about the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, people talk about preventing sickle cell disease, and they talk about it when they talk about abortion as a way to prevent sickle cell disease, which is very difficult to talk about in this country, but they also talk about it with IVF. And you know, the unique historical context of the United States has really required us to think about that in some particular ways. And with that way that you've influenced some of my work, I also wanted to just acknowledge the absence of Tiana Wolford today. Miss Wolford is my colleague and collaborator in the advocacy space around reproductive health and women with sickle cell disease in particular. And she's a native Marylander and an individual who lives with sickle cell disease. And she has done astonishing work over the last 5 years, really catapulting issues related to reproductive health for women and men with sickle cell disease into national prominence. And so it's really too bad she can't be with us today. But my collaboration with Ms. Wolford brings me to the second assignment of our reflections, which is thinking particularly in the Johns Hopkins context. You know, your anecdote about Diggs is so great. For many reasons, but one of them is that's a very profound Hopkins tradition, which in the history of sickle cell disease here at the institution now has a whole century of progress made in that model. And you know, when I think about Dr. Haywood, I think we always struggle with Carlton's legacy a little bit because he was our friend and he was our collaborator, but he was also an individual who lived with sickle cell disease, and we never want to put him only in one of those buckets because he was a dynamic human being with many lived realities. But those patient, you know, the doctor-patient partnership that Carlton developed with Sophie Landskron, with Mary Catherine, and with Pat Carroll here at Johns Hopkins really paved the way to transform how we define high quality care for people with sickle cell disease all over the country. And I can say this immodestly because I'm the interim director of the center at this moment, but I had nothing to do with developing the model. So I just walked into this amazing place. But I think, you know, this idea of what it means to be fairly treated for your pain and to have your pain acknowledged. Well, the Sickle Cell Center for Adults at Johns Hopkins is actually the national model for what it means to respectfully treat people's pain. And not just respectfully, but expertly treat pain, that you can have an expertise around doing something right, even if your patients don't always agree with your recommendations, but that there can be a science behind that partnership. And, you know, before Dr. Haywood and the generations before that in the 1970s and 60s, there was a talented patient who collaborated with Dr. Sam Sharash on the early hydroxyurea studies. And when I, through some history research that I've been doing, when I started reading about John Paul, who was sort of the face of hydroxyurea research, which is our first and best FDA-approved drug for sickle cell disease, you know, there were flashes of Carlton that I saw in the descriptions of this man whose dreams were stymied by sickle cell disease, but his commitment to the science, his interest in the work, and his willingness to partner with Sam Sharash really did something. I think Carlton did the same thing, and I think Tiana's doing the exact same thing in the work that she does. And so I just wanted to acknowledge those three legacies of patient-doctor collaboration here at Hopkins and the ways in which I think they've helped advance the national effort. You know, the last thing I'll say is maybe not as positive as it could be, but the only thing about that was average, really, as far as I can tell, about Dr. Haywood was his age at death. Dr. Haywood died at age 46, which is the median age of death for adults with sickle cell disease still in the United States. As someone who is rapidly approaching that age, it's a very sobering reality, and one that my pediatric training has not really prepared me for. You know, you go with the right training, you get the right emotional defenses. But I wanted to acknowledge that fact about Carlton because we're about to live through a terrible moment of lack of funding for federal research, and individuals with sickle cell disease have always relied disproportionately on the federal government for clinical care through HHS, but also on FDA and NIH for research advances and clinical care. And so, you know, whether Trump will follow the example of his first presidency and the example of his Republican predecessor, Richard Nixon, and try to continue doing things for sickle cell disease or not, I think is actually the question is fair game. But this is a very difficult moment for people with sickle cell disease, and I think if we're going to shift the needle on life expectancy and really make sure that we don't lose Carltons at age 46 anymore, we're going to need everybody, because we need scholars in history and sociology to give us language to talk about our problems. And we need biomedicine to make the advances to improve end organ function. And we need physicians who can fill our very painfully deficient care pipeline. The reason I'm the head of the Sickle Cell Center for Adults at Johns Hopkins as a pediatric hematologist is because there simply aren't enough adult doctors to care for this patient population. And so I think Carlton would want us to keep saying those things out loud. And I think he, I'll leave you with Carlton's words as we think about who Carlton was to you, a friend, a scholar, an individual living with sickle cell disease. I think Carlton told us who he was in the dedication to his dissertation. Carlton dedicated his dissertation to individuals living with sickle cell disease, and he said, "Our day will come."
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm honored to be here. I first knew of Carlton through reading his articles and hearing about him. And lo and behold, when I found out that we were neighbors at the Berman Institute and offices one next to each other, and we did not cross paths often at all because most of my time I'm a pediatric hematologist, oncologist, and I have the luxury, unlike Lydia, of not having to see what happens to most patients as they age out. We continue to care for our patients with sickle cell until they're young adults. But when I realized that Carlton was truly next door and we were able to be at the BI at the same time, it was eye-opening. much like your book, Dr. Wailoo, was for me, Dying in the City of Blues. And I think there's obviously many similar themes that Lydia and you spoke about, but for me, it's the importance of language and the manner in which we choose as a society to communicate with our patients with sickle cell about some of these, as you said, flashier, what I call a four-letter word, hype, for some of these transformative therapies. If you just look at some of the language that was used in the UK and the US about some of the newer drugs like voxelotor, which has its own saga, which is a medication for sickle cell that was hyped as the next greatest thing, but was just removed from the market in a very odd way because it's been shown actually to cause more harm and even deaths among patients with sickle cell. But the language that was used by those in the medical community, not from ill will, transformative, landmark, paradigm shift, remarkable, game changer. And your work has driven home for me the importance that we be humble and that we acknowledge what we know and what we don't know, but nevertheless, how we choose to communicate. And especially as we relate to people who have sickle cell, who for so long have been and unfortunately continue to be stigmatized. And you spoke about the quote about undertreating and overtreating, and things that we feel and do in the clinic every day. And I struggle with this with my colleagues all the time when I have a patient who's seen in the ER or up on the inpatient unit. Oh, he looks fine. He's on his phone. He doesn't need this medicine. And I adopt the exact opposite. I'm happy to be had once in a long time. And not that this happens in sickle cell. People with sickle cell don't have higher rates of opioid abuse disorder, but this stigma lives. So language is really important. And what Carlton, and I want to open this up for discussion because I feel that's probably going to be the most meaningful. What I've taken many things away from Carlton. First of all, I wish I knew him better. I don't know him. I didn't know him as well as Lydia did and Mary Catherine, but I knew him a little bit. But the importance of seeing someone with sickle cell as a person who has sickle cell and not someone who has sickle cell who is a person, and not dehumanizing that person based on defining them as his or her disease, which happens far too much. The sickler, the asthmatic, the diabetic, the leukemic. And it was Carlton who helped me understand that perhaps more than anyone. And I am grateful to Carlton for helping me appreciate and better appreciate that, because it is something that I rely on and that I teach to my medical students and residents on an everyday basis. And so I could go on, but I think we want to hear from the audience.
Well, do you want an opportunity to respond to anything or would you?
Other than to thank you for those words, and I feel like we should also, I'll weigh in, but others have had a chance to talk as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have about 12 minutes for questions from the audience. Travis, please.
I could shout, I'm sure they want me.
And if you want to raise your hand, I'll put you on a list so I can keep track.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Wade. It was really incredible talk. My name is Travis Reeder, and I've worked for a while on issues regarding pain and what I think about as sort of responsible opioid use. And so that's the backdrop to a question I have, particularly because on the panel with you are two pediatric hematology folks. And so a question for you about the history, but I'm also just interested to know sort of clinically how folks respond to this, is whether there's a difference in this history of stigma between children and adults. Because I could imagine it running multiple ways, actually. You know, there's this objective subjective divide where we imagine that the patient is always lying to us for secondary gain. You might think that kids just wouldn't have that developed in a way, and so you might treat them better in some sense because they're not, you know, seeking something. or we are really good at also just, not listening to kids in all sorts of ways. So I'm just interested if you have a perspective on the history and actually clinically kind of, how that works out. Thanks.
Yeah, what I would say is that it's a really terrific question for which I don't have a great answer, because most of the conversation that I tracked in the book focused on cohorts as they aged. But you are pointing out a question, and I think both of the comments are focusing on the idea that we need to think beyond kind of a monolithic community. And we also need to, part of imbuing people with sickle cell disease with texture and meaning and complexity is to understand how the experience changes as you move from early childhood through adolescence into young adulthood, how you navigate moving from practitioners who are pediatric hematologists to adult hematologists, and what that experience is in this, and using that to understand the differences of need. So I really don't have an answer, because I don't see, the only conversation on pain that really popped up in the 1970s had to do with infants, young children in pain, and which is a completely different story. But people who did sickle cell work, like Elliot Vichinsky, were actually at the forefront of trying to reshape a conversation about how we think about pain, particularly in younger children who are not even able to articulate what their experience is, let alone like lobby for pain meds. So I don't really have an answer to your question, but I hope.
I can, this was not a setup, but what you just said is a wonderful segue. And the answer to your question as far as kids and how people in the profession address them with kids who have sickle cell pain is yes. In other words, it's infants who have probably the only form of the classic hallmark of sickle cell pain that's obvious. Pain is subjective, as Carlton spoke about and wrote about many times. It's not something that is like Pauling wanted is tattooed on your forehead. But in infants with sickle cell, oftentimes they have the first manifestation of pain is something called dactylitis, painful swelling of the hands or feet. And because you can see it, and it's the only type of sickle cell pain really that's obvious, and because they were infants, many clinicians want to treat that. But that same kid, forget adult, I mean, that's Lydia's world, I'm not going there. But that same kid in my clinic, when she's 10, and who no longer has dactylitis but is complaining of pain, suddenly there's a much greater hesitancy to treat that. And I can also tell you, this is something that Travis knows, he and I spoke, we need to write this paper, by the way, has spoken about before. I also take care of children with cancer. When the kid with cancer has pain and says they have pain, how much morphine do you want?
I think because I have this pediatric training, I've been working with adults, and I'm sort of ruined for pediatrics, it turns out. But or I'm in recovery, it depends on who you ask. I think so. The first thing is how we train physicians to in my mind, it's how we train physicians to talk about pain with patients and what stories we tell about pain. And I've become increasingly interested in that at Hopkins, and because we've increasingly used buprenorphine for adults with complex chronic pain with to some degree such remarkable effect that I think if a drug company showed you this data, you'd think that they had invented it all. So but one of the challenges is in the narratives that physicians know about pain. So part of that is fractured based on what your training base, what you see, right, every day. So if you care for children, what you see usually is in early childhood, a waxing and waning picture of pain, where you can have pain spikes manifesting as dactylitis, manifesting as all kinds of crises in any body part. But that the general expectation for the parents and for the child and for the clinicians is that the pain score, the pain resolution will be complete, that child will go back, will resume normal childhood and a pain-free existence. But for almost everyone with sickle cell disease, somewhere between age 10 and 20, some form of complex chronic pain develops. And so, you know, for the last 7 years, I've welcomed young adults into the adult clinic and cared for them there. And when I meet them for the first time, they're leaving their pediatric home where I've never cared for them. And I meet them there, almost to a one, they say that they get low back pain. And almost to a one, they've never been told that they're going to have that low back pain for the rest of their life. Anyway, and they've also almost never been told that there's probably a pretty reasonable pathobiological mechanism to explain that pain, which is that sickle cell, you know, affects the bones in the back, and so the spine is affected. But and you can see that, I mean, everybody gets a chest X-ray at some point with sickle cell disease, and if you get it, it's sort of in the time frame when this starts showing up, you can see in the changes in the bony changes in the spine to explain this low back pain. But you know, 21, 22, 23-year-olds, they haven't heard from their pediatric hematologist that this is the rest of their life, partly because, you know, in defense of the pediatric hematologist, they don't live with them through the next 20, 40 years. So how you talk about pain matters, and what pain you see, and whether it's visible, right, whether it's visible, whether you can prove it with an X-ray, whether you can't prove it. I think that's a big deal, and it does change in adulthood. It functionally changes in adulthood. So how treatment happens in adulthood changes as well. And these issues of short-acting chronic opioids and buprenorphine become more salient. I think the place where we see, unfortunately, more harmonies between pediatric and adult care is in the emergency department, where if you're lucky enough to be cared for at a place with expert sickle cell care in pediatrics or adults, Dr. Nguru and I both trained at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where they have a very large sickle cell patient population and fairly streamlined pathways to get children triaged and treated for pain when they present, because it's a huge patient population. They have to have a way to manage them well and expertly. And similarly here at Hopkins, in the adult and pediatric settings, there's individual care plans, especially in the adult setting actually, that help expedite care for patients as much as possible into the back of the ED so that people can get quick pain care. And obviously our infusion center exists to do that on an even more expert and brisk level as often as possible. But I think that outside of the exceptions, which there are exceptions in Oakland and all over the country, it's where Elliot Paczynski is. There's exceptions all over the country, but the rule for children and the rule for adults, if they're treated in inexpert settings, is that they are greeted with skepticism. They are greeted with scorn. They are treated with blame. They are told that if they don't do X, Y, or Z, they are going to die. They are deprived of reproductive health care if they don't agree to have, you know, there's a story in Stat News recently of a woman in the South being told by a doctor that he would treat her pain if she didn't terminate her pregnancy. So, you know, these issues of power and control get quickly caught up in who the hand that writes the opioids.
Can I ask a question of, this is a question that comes from having spent a lot of time in Memphis.
Yeah.
And trying to understand the cultural politics of this Mid-South community that is on the borders with Mississippi and Arkansas, anxious about people coming in, but also conservative in its attitudes towards drugs. And I'm struck by Baltimore and the stories that you're telling about the clinical world of sickle cell here.
Yeah.
And I'm also struck by your reference to John Paul and hydroxyurea, Dr. Sharash, and whether there's in your view, and forgive me, I'm a historian, so I'm asking a history question about how would you characterize the role of patients and the unique kind of the specificity of doing this work in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And to what extent, and there's a corollary question, which is, I find myself interested in like the history of patients and what we can say about how they inform and shape the culture of the medical system. But I was just curious because you're like living that.
Thanks for that. Interesting. I'm going to go home to your diary today. Dr. Wailoo asked me a history question. Thanks for that interesting question. You know, as you were talking, so I've been studying Hopkins sickle cell history, and I've been very concerned that I will get fall down a deep well of Hopkins exceptionalism. So I'm sure you're aware of the risk there. You're just student of history. But you know, one of the stories from studying Dean Paul and his family, Diana Sugg was a Pulitzer Prize, she still is, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who reported on the Paul family and their experiences with sickle cell disease. And in the first story, sort of chronicling the Paul family's relationships to this disease in Baltimore, they were a West Baltimore family, multiple children with sickle cell disease in their family were affected. And she describes Dean Paul right at this age of transition, Travis, right in his teenage years, and he had horrible pain, and he was going around the city to get care. And you know, at that time in the 70s, there were still hospitals that existed that treated Black patients predominantly in a way that doesn't exist in the current explicitly in the current landscape. Providence Hospital in the north part of the city in particular, but Dean had gone to all of these places to get medical care, and the only place that his mother found, basically his mother got on the phone with Sam, and his mother and he described, mostly his mother, describes that Suresh believed him. And it's this, it's almost a cliche in sickle cell care when, in contemporary sickle cell care that we teach our trainees, you got to believe the patient. And here it is spelled out in this relationship that started in the 1960s, that this historically pivotal relationship between this investigator and this patient starts with this fundamental act of being believed. And, is that a uniquely Baltimore story? I've thought a lot about that. I mean, I think there are dimensions of this being a Hopkins story about this relationship between patients and doctors at this institution.
So the reason why I asked, and forgive me, I'll just.
Yeah.
Is that often we tell the story about innovation as if it's, and this actually gets back to like equity and innovation, right? We tell it as if there's innovation and then there's patience. But you're telling a different kind of story.
That's right.
About, and you were talking about collaboration in paper. It's about a particular kind of collaboration.
Correct.
That's rooted in not suspicion, but a different affect towards, the people, but that which is potentially a model for how we should think. And so, but it's a product of, so Lemuel Diggs, what was funny is in his history, he didn't start off as being interested in Black folks.
Right.
He was interested in sickle cell disease.
Mhm.
And he was a pathologist, so he was interested in all the different kinds of things that could go wrong with the body.
Right.
And as the science changed and as it became clinically and socially important, suddenly he was working with Black communities, and he really the disease pulled him along. So much so that in 1971, he received the Martin Luther King Medical Achievement Award, right? Now here's the interesting thing. He remained conservative from the standpoint on issues like sickle cell trait and high altitudes. But he also was the kind of person, my book started because I traveled out. Here's a funny story. I was teaching in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 1993. And I was finishing a first book, and I thought, well, I should really work on this sickle cell book. And I know this guy who was born in 1900. I'm sure his papers are somewhere out in Tennessee. So I called the archives, and they said, well, Dr. Diggs still comes in from time to time. So I called him, and I actually drove out and interviewed him. And he opened up this scrapbook, and he had collected a history of sickle cell disease based on, and that was the beginning of so to me, there are kinds of interesting collaborations.
Yep.
That are better models of what innovation, what leads to innovation and what innovation should aspire to. And that's partly what my ears, picked up when you were describing that relationship. So I would say and to me, it's not so much a Hopkins exceptionalism issue as it is a model that we should be embracing in thinking about what innovation should look like.
I would I do my practice, I mean, I am a Hopkins faculty member, a proud member of the Berman Institute School of Medicine, but I do my clinical practice up the road at another hospital, and I would say it's not unique to Hopkins, it's unique to this notion of collaboration, and it is something that if we are honest with ourselves and with and it's not just our patients, it's our families in pediatric sickle cell care. If we are honest with ourselves and we allow ourselves the opportunity to hear them out and to have a platform and to help guide our research endeavors, there's the opportunity for us not only to learn a tremendous amount, but to potentially affect change at the disease level. And I increasingly have started to collaborate academically with patients and or parents. And it is amazing what one can learn, because what we think is our David Letterman top 10 list is not necessarily our patients or our patients' parents' top 10 lists. And certainly there's crossover, but it is very, very humbling.
So we are all already a little over time, but I think we have a question from online. But then I will let you all know, you can stay around and chat longer because we have a reception for until 5:30. So please, Mary Catherine.
Thank you. This is not a question, but I think it's a nice way to end. Mrs. Haywood, Carlton's mom, texted me and said to thank you for all you're doing and will continue to do for people with sickle cell disease. She reminded me that when Carlton was 3 years old, he said he was going to be a doctor to make all people well who have sickle cell disease, and he did his best, and she's counting on you all to continue.
Amen.
Amen. Yeah.
With that, I will invite you to join us for a reception and to continue the conversation. Thank you all so very much for being here. I'm gonna turn that off so we don't.
Yeah, yeah. Something as simple.
Thank you for the talk.
Traditional in the.
Want to tell people where the food is?
No,
No, I just.
Yes.
Coming to dinner?
I am, are you?
Yeah.
I'm driving Keith down.
For those of you who were able to stay with us for the reception, the food is just behind those doors, either end. Thank you.